Well, 20 years ago this week, Canada was in the grips of one of its worst natural disasters. The ice storm of 1998 shut down eastern Ontario and southern Quebec into parts of New Brunswick. The ice tore down hydro towers, plunging millions of homes into the dark for up to 6 weeks. At one point, half of the entire population of Quebec had no power. 35 people died in this disaster, and 500,000 people were forced from their homes. In the end, it left $5 billion in damage. But with the cost came many lessons. Joining me now with a look at what we learned is Francois Bouffard of McGill University. Francois, thank you so much for being here this morning.
Good morning, Ben.
All right, so it's been a long time. I remember it as if it were yesterday, though. What was the big takeaway message from this ice storm for city officials across the country?
Well, I think it's especially when you look at this. Well, again, I'll take my example where I was at the time was a student at McGill in Montreal, and going back to the 9th of January 1998 when all traffic lights went down, the city treatment plant for the water went down, the metro system went down all at the same time. They have this common failure that it is really widespread. So I think municipal officials really and risk managers have to be really conscious of what these large scale failures can do to society. You can also again look at the blackout in 2003, which affected Ontario. You had massive amounts of people trying to leave the Toronto core, traffic jams, et cetera, et cetera. So it puts a lot of pressure on emergency services. Again, the case of Montreal was one of which was quite dramatic. Again, not having enough water pressure, for instance, if there had been a fire, when you have people using makeshift heating devices and candles, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there was a lot of anxiety for people themselves about not knowing what was going to happen, and also again trying to reassure the people, and again having the infrastructure in place to take care of people when they're being put out of their houses, for instance.
But let's talk a little bit more about that infrastructure. How did our approach change to the notion of maintaining a power supply during a situation like that?
Well, obviously, I'll take the very much the Quebec version because this is the one I know the best. What happened in Quebec had never been seen before. When you see your power infrastructure being taken down completely, just a bit, if you want a good an example, which is current, is the case of Puerto Rico when it's been completely wiped out. It's not just a repair mission; you're actually in a rebuilding mission for the utilities. And then it's usually in the case of the 98 ice storm, it was again, we had the ice, and then after that the cold came, so you have to send crews in the field, and that's quite onerous on them, and you have to source all the materials, source all the equipment in a very short amount of time in the middle of the winter. So that was really, I think, for Hydro-Quebec, the greatest challenge. So having the right amount of spares, having the right amount of crews ready to go, and though obviously, like any kind of long-term disaster, you have to be also conscious of getting sure that your crews are getting enough sleep and rest so that they can be fresh and not hurt themselves when they're in the field.
In Montreal, the city of Westmount, which is right in the middle of the city, never lost power. It was an island of light in the middle of the outage, and it was because Westmount has taken steps to bury their power lines. Now, this was also a recommendation after the storm, but, driving around a lot of major cities in Canada, we still see a lot of power lines still hovering above the ground. Why don't the cities take steps to do that and make that happen?
Well, to be perfectly honest, it comes down to cost. The question always comes down to who's going to pay the bill. In the end, it's going to be the ratepayer, and there has to be some kind of a cost-benefit analysis that has to take place. Especially if you're doing a retrofit, so you're taking the wires which are in the air and you're putting them on the ground. There's a significant cost associated with that. It's a lot easier, for instance, if you have a new housing development where the developers or perhaps the city officials require that all the wired infrastructure is put on the ground. That's probably the way forward. And there's some cities across Canada that have done that. But it's probably primarily a question of cost. and whatever infrastructure, any kind of infrastructure project, be it water, gas, or sewers, it's always going to be high cost. And then the question is, how do you recover the cost? And here, this is not a municipal infrastructure per se. It's usually sometimes the companies running this are for profit, and they are regulated monopolies, so they need to get those costs approved before going forward. So there has to be a good benefit case made.
Francois Bouffard, I could talk about this all day. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ben.